thanks to Professor Hansen and to the APPI, my old friend Chris Wolf, for bringing me here. University of Dallas is one of my favorite places to come. I don't come every year, maybe every 4 years, but it goes way back. And I'm very appreciative of the students, too, coming this time of the academic year. I know what April means. April is bad for students. The first week of May is bad for faculty. So, any social philosophy worthy of the name begins and always returns to 4 questions. The first 2 I'd call ontological. Who belongs to whom? Question number 1. Remember when I was in high school, junior year, everyone said, who belongs to whom? People are dating. It's fundamentally human to ask this question. Now, I don't mean in a proprietary sense, like ownership of an automobile or a slave. Rather, I mean a social membership. 2 or more persons holding themselves out to the rest of the world as one, at least with regard to their specific social bond. Question number 2. By the way, there's 50 other questions connected to that one, but I'm telescoping. Question number 2. For what purpose or ends? What are they trying to perfect through their union? For example, the preamble to the U.S. Constitution begins, in order to form a more perfect union. And then they start giving reasons. Domestic tranquility, securing the blessings of liberty for future generations. So, the first 2 are ontological. Who belongs to whom, and what are they up to when they're doing that? The next 2 I would call generally moral. So, question number 3. What do the members owe to one another? Surely, actions and things. For an audience at UD, I do not need to recite the traditional matrimonial vows, which are basically a summary of who owes what to whom, what they owe with regard to loves and actions. But there's a correlate question built into this one. What do the rest of us owe to them as a society? So, for example, John Paul II, in his letter to families, says, what do the rest of us owe to the family? Not just what the family owes to one another. And he contended, because the family is a community, a social subject that transcends the sum of its parts, we owe it recognition as a social subject, and we owe it honora, honor. Before we owe it money or houses or police protection, we owe it recognition. 4th question. What kind of love is owed in any particular society? A love that binds people together. Do the members love their union for its own sake? I think what the scholastic philosophers would call amor amicitiae, a love of friendship. I don't just love the other person, I love the union with the other person. Okay. Or do they love their union for the sake of some other love? It's something we always want to ascertain. As St. Thomas put it, we should measure the love of different persons according to the different kinds of union, so that a man is more loved in matters touching upon that particular union in respect of which he is loved. And again, in comparing love to love, we should compare one union with another. So, here's my rather blunt opening bid. There's 4 questions. We always have to come back to them. What kind of union? For what end or ends? What do the members owe with regard to actions and things? What sort of love forms the bond? Let me opine, or just assert, social sciences are not very well geared to ask or answer these questions. But lest I be misunderstood, I happily concede that one or another social science could prove very useful to anyone who does know how to ask these questions. There are very competent social scientists who are aware of ontological and moral realities that stand above and below their science of correlated data. Then, unfortunately, there are most social scientists who never leave the domain of aggregated data sets and never ask the most intuitively compelling questions about social life. Social capital theorists, we'll always hear about social capital, suggest that the resources of social participation should be evaluated in 3 dimensions. The type of society, is it a sports club, a political party, maybe a motorcycle club? The scope of memberships, how many affiliations are you into? Sort of like high school kids when they apply to college, they just list all these affiliations and groups they're parts of. And the intensity of participation, are they very active or merely compliant? The problem is that by design, social capital methodology is committed to a very weak typology regarding the kinds of social life, their respective ends, the internal modes of union intended by common action. For social capital analysis, social capital, trust and cooperation, is a surplus produced by individual actions that are in some general way social. What matters, however, is not a ranking of social orders in an ontological or anthropological or even a moral basis. What matters is the individual skills and maybe morale that's built up by diverse social engagements. Social capital theorists, at the end of the day, want to give a quantitative picture. More or less social interaction. For example, a very well-respected and quoted recent study on social capital concludes, quote, "The most productive form of participation with regard to the formation of social capital seems to be not only participation in several associations, but multiple affiliations and associations for different purposes," unquote. So, a motorcycle club, the Knights of Columbus, a bowling team, the National Guard, a family. What these analysts are interested in is the accumulation and diversification of social interaction. Now, compare that kind of focus to memberships in what could be called non-substitutional societies. And just allow me to give my own definition of a non-substitutional society. A non-substitutional society, 1, there is no social equivalent. A bowling team does not substitute for a parish, even though a parish may have bowling teams. Oh, I think I like your family. I'll swap it out with mine. It doesn't work that way. 2, inclusion in the society means full inclusion or no inclusion at all. So, as Catholics, we believe that in baptism, we become a member of the body of Christ. True. Not a partial member of the body of Christ, but a full member of the body of Christ. However good we end up in our actions or fidelity to it, but not halfway. 3, membership is irreducibly social, which means that the social relations do not come into existence by virtue of exchanges or distributions. You don't buy your way in to these things. Rather, exchanges and distributions presuppose the social union itself. First, you need the social union, then you can figure out what's going to be exchanged and distributed. You can't cash in or cash out. I mean, even in our somewhat demented culture of marriage and divorce today, no one believes, not even the most liberal judge would believe, that one can take away 35% of the marriage. You can't cash it out. 4, members intend for the society to be more than transient. The union of a family or a marriage cannot be intended to happen only on Tuesday and Thursdays for the next 24 months. Actually, not even our law, our civil law, would permit that. Okay. In other words, an unsubstitutional society having these kind of properties completely elude the methodology of most social capital theorists. And most social capital theorists can't hardly imagine the social virtues that are necessary for sustaining that kind of society. Now, some social scientists do look deeper, albeit behind a veil of aggregate data. For example, in a recent groundbreaking study, it's online, you can get it, I highly urge you to read it, it's very readable. The Princeton economists, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, examining the breakdown of white, middle and lower middle class societies in our country, studying the rates of mortality and morbidity, come to the conclusion that patterns of mortality and morbidity move in tandem, I'm quoting, with withdrawal from marriage, children, religious congregations, and civic society. Now, they're not intending here to give a philosophy. They're simply noting, as social scientists, that the correlation is really strong. When people go down, they're getting sick all the time, going to prison, not meeting their debts, not working. It's correlated, not with economy, it's correlated with not being able to sustain lives in those 3 necessary societies. To fail at these societies is kind of more serious than thinking out on your bowling team. Now, here I've already now introduced my topic, the notion of 3 necessary societies: domestic life, political life, and ecclesial life. Necessary for what? Necessary for human happiness and flourishing. In Catholic social doctrine, these societies have morally normative features with respect to their respective mode of union and the ends that the members ought to pursue. These 3 societies, domestic is surprisingly complex, because it actually includes 2 kinds of union. Actually 3. Union of man and woman in marriage, union of the parents with the children, and the union of the children among themselves. It's a surprisingly ontologically dense society. Anyone who thinks that marriage is the simple one hasn't studied it or lived it. These 3 societies have traditionally conjured the metaphor of living bodies, which is probably drawn from the fact, or at least the aspiration, that these 3 societies not only have common action and cooperation, but a common life. They live together, albeit in different ways. Their members live together not as a common substance, but as an intentional union, since living together is usually regarded as something so concretely and irreducibly social. It's not surprising that we take note of, indeed, just as Case and Deaton took note of in their groundbreaking study last year, the health or decadence of social life by focusing and refocusing on domestic, political, and ecclesial orders. What the magisterial tradition calls communio, or koinonia, denotes a society whose common good includes not just the common action of its members, but a union that's loved for its own sake, but which is not opposed to, but a condition for the perfection of every member in it. That the members intend a permanent, even a transgenerational society, which makes these 3 societies, necessary societies, different than, let's say, a military unit or a team that needs a very high level of cohesion for special and temporary purposes. Rather, the members of a society having koinonia intend to realize goods beyond those of mutual and transient needs. And most importantly, they share a common life in the concrete sense of living together. More about living together in just a sec. Last year, at exactly this month, at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, where I gave a paper, in fact, a version of this one, the Pope gave a message to our academy where Pope Francis emphasized the difference between what he calls bonds and links, legami vinculi. These links could amount, the Pope said, to only social instrumentalities of individual liberty, rather than a specifically fraternal bond. The word legami for bond is really, because that's where we get the word law from, right? That's where we get the word religion from. A legami is like a ligament, something that binds together. And one of our academicians, probably the best known and most highly respected Catholic economist in Europe, he's at Milan, Stefano Zamagni, said, quote, "It is proper to distinguish between social interaction and interpersonal relationships. Whereas in the case of the latter, the personal identities of the persons are involved and are constituent of the relationship itself, social interactions, as they are studied in the literature on social capital, can perfectly well be anonymous and impersonal." I've never been on Facebook, but people tell me it could be like that. Indeed, he goes on to note, this is really interesting, the term common good is often used equivocally in public discourse. Sometimes it stands for divisible goods that are distributed and accumulated, or for the indivisible good of a social bond or a friendship. And Zamagni points out in some recent studies in Italy and in Germany have shown that when the term common good is identified with democratic freedoms or rights, or with the generic object of redistributive policies, the concept is readily affirmed. It says, I like that. Common good's great. However, when it is presented as a good that not only is shared by citizens, but also exists somehow in its own right, transcending the sum of the parts, it's not so readily affirmed. So if we only look to socially interactive exchanges and distributions, we really have not yet adequately distinguished the results of individual self-interest operating within the context of a morally indifferent market from the exchanges and distributions within a domestic social order. We have not distinguished bonds and links. Now, my point is not to deny the importance of relatively transient social links, constituting somewhat revisable loyalties. A full social life recognizable to us in the early 21st century includes many voluntary and revisable associations. Right? I mean, every time I go to a concert, I'm not entering into deep bonds with everyone in the audience. But it's good to be in an audience. It's good to be in the piazza. My interest, rather, is in distinguishing, here's the point, to distinguish a society in the full and normative sense from social interactions that might or might not enrich our lives. The question here is distinguishing. And if we fail to make that distinction, the transient and revisable socialities will inevitably become the measure of the necessary societies. It's already happened, friends. And thus, civic, familial, and ecclesial friendships are modeled on Facebook, or membership in a sports club. Things are measured by the total number of tweets. The question here is being able to distinguish. Now, as I said, especially from the time of Pope Leo through Pius XI, this notion of necessary societies for human flourishing has been asserted over and over again. You don't have to look far. It's actually right in Rerum Novarum. Pius XI stated, Now there are three necessary societies distinct from one another and yet harmoniously combined by God, into which man is born. Two, namely, the family and civil society, belong to the natural order, and the third, the church, to the supernatural order. So, to paraphrase Aristotle, the human person is a matrimonial, familial animal, a political animal, and an ecclesial animal. And to use Leo's term now, in all three cases, we are meant to dwell in. He uses the term inhabitere, to dwell in these societies. Let's say in contrast to social movements, political parties, field hospitals, Starbucks, or culture without boundaries. You don't dwell in Starbucks. People hang out there for a long time, but people really don't dwell in Starbucks. To repeat, there really are more transient, revisable associations that are subject to the free designs of human ingenuity. Should these kinds of associations wither, we'd have a problem. But a demise of the necessary societies would be a social calamity. So, my next section, our housed existence, H-O-U-S-E-D, remarks on living together. The theme of social participation by way of common dwelling is perhaps the most ancient of all the social tropes. It has reappeared in interesting and useful ways in recent Catholic theology, especially in the teachings of Pope Francis, who tends to look more carefully and affectionately at concrete social life than what we would call institutions dominated by legal generalities. More about Francis later. I take the expression, our housed existence, from the International Theological Commission's work in Communion and Stewardship, Human Persons Created in the Image of God. It was signed and issued by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger in 2004. The commission set out to study the relational being of Imago Dei, according to Genesis. And a quote from that report, signed by Ratzinger. We could say that a properly Christian theology of ecology is an application of the theology of creation. Noting that the term ecology combines the two Greek words, oikos, house, and logos, word. The physical environment of human existence can be conceived by us as a kind of house for human life. Given that the inner life of the Blessed Trinity is one of communion, the divine act of creation is the gratuitous production of partners to share in this communion. Unquote. So these two senses of dwelling or economy, personal communion and stewardship, are developed in interesting ways by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. I wish he had referred to the International Theological Commission. That's where he got it from. The focal meaning of social, Francis insists, is the capacity for living together in communion. This seems so obvious it almost sounds banal, but it's not banal, actually. He has said many critical things about more extended and complex social institutions, but he's remarkably insistent about the primacy of common life. Think of one of the earliest remarks he made about priests, the shepherds. They need to live in a way they can smell their sheep. Okay. Environmental issues, indeed, have a deep root in excesses, the excesses of lifestyle and consumption that ought to be detected first in our communities of common life, in marriage and in family and in church, should be in polity. Excesses of production and consumption, rationally infinite desires for things, would show up in a marriage and a family as pure poison right away. So he writes this. In the family, we learn closeness, care and respect for others. We break out of our fatal self-absorption. and come to realize that we are living with and alongside others who are worthy of our concern, kindness, and affection. There is no social bond without this primary, everyday, almost microscopic aspect of living side by side, crossing paths at different times of the day, being concerned about everything that affects us, helping one another with ordinary little things. The family is to Francis the principal agent of integral ecology because it's the nursery of learning by practice social inclusion that transcends what he calls mere links. Societies enjoying real communion also have a root in gratuitous beneficence because the principle of inclusion does not originate in satisfying debts by exchange or distribution. You can't buy your way in. If you did, it would be regarded as perverse. Traditionally, for example, distributive justice operates within an already given social inclusion. One does not become a member by the fact of being given something. Rather, one is giving something because one is a member who merits or needs whatever should be given. Distributive justice, check it out in Aristotle and Aquinas, always has the structure of what we, the giver in distributive justice is us, what we owe to our members. In a family, for example, the sick child gets the medicine, not necessarily the child who has saved up his or her allowance. Hence, from a truly social point of view that we're trying to elaborate here, the term redistribution is entirely misleading. Within a already given social order, distribution is always dynamical and proportional. It has to be done over and over again with due adjustments for the group and its members. So to put RE in front of it means nothing. It's just distributive justice. But within our societies today that begin by default with goods exchanged by individuals in market relations, redistribution carries a very strong meaning, namely that of methodological individualism. It's Austrian School of Economics. Start in this way. At any given and rather abstract slice of time, distribution is nothing other than the net aggregate of goods held by virtue of innumerable exchanges. Oh, distribution is going on all the time in the justice of exchange. So where does distribution add something that exchange hasn't already accomplished? Well, people deem the net aggregate as politically or morally insufficient. Some power, most likely the government, must redistribute what's already been neutrally accomplished by choices within a market. And on this scenario, social membership would itself seem to be created by a redistribution. Or to put it in another way, more or less the lines of Pope Benedict in Caritas and Veritate, the market and the society are always in a contest that can't be resolved. For the market, distribution is nothing other than the sum of exchanges. But for society, distributions must be reconstructed. And thus, the specifically social principle appears to be jerry-rigged, making a rather late and arbitrary appearance on the stage of market efficiencies. But the modern market has no home. It's disembedded not only from the domus, but even from the civitas. So let me now burrow down just one more level at the word necessary, when the popes use the term a necessary society. Aristotle seemed to believe that although all human societies begin in neediness and interdependence, only polity completes itself by excellence of friendship, beyond what was required to meet the initial needs. Far from me to correct Aristotle, but I would add that analogically, each of these necessary societies aim at a friendship beyond the initial need. Perhaps these three meanings of necessary will help us to think about the issue. First, let's think about an authentic human need that has some purchase on the word necessity. Namely, human beings often need to submit to collective action for protection of life. And thus arise collectivized solidarities along the lines of a military unit. Indeed, a submission to the group to such an extent that the collective goal matters more than the individual. To be comrades. To be comrades is to desire that the group survive, not yourself, at the end of the day. But when the emergency is met, the relationship between members should go back to normal. Response to the immediate need protects an authentic good, to be sure, but if it continued unabated, we would hardly call such a social situation compatible with human eudaimonia. This is why military soldiers coming back from war find it very difficult to go back to normal. Rousseau had a deep admiration for the Spartans, right, who didn't really allow the institution of marriage. Not really. Because the soldiers were on permanent military duty as comrades. And Rousseau said that collectivization is so wonderful, but modern people can't take it. In fact, he called the Spartans haters of men. So one kind of need, to reiterate, is that we often do have to be comrades. And we have to submit our action and our minds and lives to the group to meet a human need. But you can't keep on doing that, right? It would be a nightmare to live that way. I come from a Marine Corps family. Second, let's think of an authentic human need that requires some social interaction. I need to know how to install a sprinkler system. But once I learn how to do it by learning from others, my dependence on the expert can be jettisoned. It was really an authentic need, and I had to rely on other people. I had to sit at their feet and learn and watch. But once I have it, my dependence can be jettisoned. Neither of these two that I've mentioned capture a deeper kind of necessity, and the kind of necessity I believe that the magisterium has in mind. The deepest kind of social necessity is the bond or the friendship itself, to be included in the life of another, and thus the dignified social orders, husband, wife, parents, children, siblings, fellow citizens, members of Christ's kingdom. And these bonds are necessary in two ways. Indeed, because of our neediness. What are the chances of human flourishing without membership in these societies? No family, no parents, no social bond, no civitas, no order of justice beyond your uncles? By the way, as sinners and as bound by chains of mortality, no forgiveness and divine life, they're all based in profound needs that we have. But by way of excellence, the bonds are perfective, enduring beyond the satisfaction of the initial need in the three necessary societies. Excellence supervenes upon the original need. And I think perhaps this is why Aristotle said that friendship is better in good times than in bad. Well, everyone knows why you need friends in bad times. Aristotle said it's even better in good times because the excellence of the bond of the friendship flowers and is on full display. By the way, all of these points are made right in Rerum Novarum. Reread it. Begins with the need to work. It's rooted in neediness, Leo XIII says. Labor. But that neediness is transcended and perfected in the dignity of the labor, the rational foresight of the laborer, for the purpose of the obligation to family beyond emergencies. That's why he urges enough of a wage to be a saver the eye to the future of your family, and the needs for the justice of the political community. Being friends in that sense, and the school of supernatural virtue of the church, which teaches not only supernatural virtues, but ennobles the natural ones like thrift. But another closely related meaning of necessity for eudaimonia is love. The scriptural rendition of the Golden Rule, which virtually all cultures have recognized, is to love one's neighbor as oneself. It stands at the nexus of justice and love. No human society can be sustained without such acts. And sacred scripture itself begins with the plutonium grade example, right in Genesis 2. Adam loves Eve as bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh. And as St. Paul says, as another self, as a man loves his own body, so he loves his wife. Now, there are many examples of the Golden Rule as it applies to buying and selling, the recognition of a fellow citizen, children in a family recognizing their siblings as kinds of other selves. But imagine the difficulty of getting all of these relationships right without either the experience or the exemplary causality of marriage. It's the plutonium grade example of loving someone as you love yourself. As St. Thomas writes, this is real union, which the lover seeks with the object of his love. Moreover, this union is in keeping with the demands of love, for as the philosopher relates, Aristophanes said that lovers would wish to be united both into one, but since this would result in either one or both being destroyed, they seek a suitable and becoming union, to live together, speak together, and to be united in all other like things. Society is deeply rooted in the command to love another human being as you love yourself. That's social capital. And just imagine how thin and brittle the loyalty of societies without these nurseries of love. And then again, and now I move to the principle of subsidiarity, imagine the problem. If the love of union in one society is cut off from having any traction in the others. Indeed, the principle of subsidiarity begins with the notion that enjoying various ways of enjoying communion are orderable one to the other without prejudice to their own specific common life. Every temporal society is orderable beyond itself because human flourishing requires one to be more than just a good spouse or a good child or a good brother or a good citizen or a good parishioner. But getting this right is very difficult. And so at stake, here's the principle of subsidiarity, as I understand it, but viewed somewhat differently than the way it's usually presented. Usually we understand subsidiarity in terms of authorities or powers from above, impacting on those from below. While this picture is not necessarily wrong, it can prove to be very misleading because the obligation to give subsidium, aid, assistance, cannot be assigned exclusively to a relatively higher power. It cannot be true that domestic and ecclesial societies are merely recipients rather than givers of assistance to the political community. Once again, just read Rerum Novarum. Unless that implication is foreclosed, the regulative principle that protects societies other than the state would tragically deny the agency and efficacy of those very societies with regard to the social whole. They would only be recipients, never a giver. Now, for his part, Pius XII, who remembers made Pope in 1939 and lasts until 58, began to see the problem of the top-down model of subsidiarity and why you had to tweak it, at least tweak it. And he said, quote, "Every social activity is for its nature subsidiary. It must serve as a support to the members of the social body and never destroy or absorb them. These are surely enlightened words, valid for the social life in all of its grades and also for the life of the church without prejudice to its hierarchical structure." Unquote. The top-down model of subsidiarity was emphasized in modern times, let's say from the late 19th century up to through the World War II era, for the good reason is that the church was responding especially to totalitarianism and to the global economic crisis, which was making the power of the polity or the state much too strong. But we need to remember this. The virtue of giving resides chiefly in the giver. If you read Thomas Hobbes, in what does the virtue of justice reside? It's in the giver, not the recipient. I mean, I lose a $20 bill and someone else finds it and gives it back to me. The virtue is in the giver, not for me just getting my $20 bill back. Each of these three societies has to be a giver to have the virtue. Now, matrimonial society and the family give subsidium to the rest of society by way of efficient, material, I think especially exemplary causality. On the supposition that we're dealing with a relatively complex social whole, in which two or more societies are nested, we can affirm two things. First, that every social agent, high or low, provides assistance to the others, albeit in ways proper to their own union. Second, that the giving of assistance has a limit. Namely, it must not destroy or undermine the social unity belonging to the person or the social entity being assisted. I call this cybernetical subsidiarity only to point out that it's going on at the same time. It's not like an assembly line. My colleague in Milan, Stefano Samani, calls it just circular subsidiarity. And I think it's particularly apt at describing how domestic, political, and ecclesial societies are subsidiary to one another, right, without any prejudice to their own way of life and their own hierarchies. In fact, a multilateral and communicative hierarchy would seem to follow from the very idea that domestic, political, and ecclesial communities are necessary for human eudaimonia. Members who dwell in the family also dwell in the parish and also dwell in the civic community. It has to be a circular subsidium. Charles Taylor, whose work I very much admire, calls this principle hierarchical complementarity. A fancier term, but it means the same thing. Society is made up of different social orders having relations that are truly mutual. They need one another. Domestic life needs polity. Polity needs domestic life. But one cannot replace the others. So this is why Francis refers to the family as a primary communion, but also as a setting, as in a hub for further solidarities. Family, polity, and church exist for themselves in the perfections of their members and for the others whose members overlap with their own. Such a mutuality of social life, sustained over time, and not just in emergencies, is what the ancient tradition and St. Augustine meant by tranquility of order. Tranquility of order is nothing other than plural societies living with one another for mutual benefit by way of circular subsidiarity. My conclusion. The golden era of Catholic social doctrine, the era of what some people called the Great Coherency, 1878 to about 1968. And it had three chapters to it, let's call it. There was the Leonine era, when Leo becomes Pope in 1878. I call it the philosophical era. It had great coherence, trying to outline a Catholic and very perennial understanding of social order. Then what I would call the troubled era, post-World War I to about 1945. Nothing but trouble. The church did everything it could to protect, especially the matrimonial and domestic society, against totalitarianism. To some extent against liberalism, but mainly it was the totalitarians that were the villains of that story. So in the 1930s, communism and economic meltdown really frightened the church. The school issue was so important because in the school, who belongs to whom? Parents? Do the children belong to the parents? To the state or to the church? In fact, if you go back to mid-19th century and go up to about 1945, and all you read in papal encyclicals and church statements was comments on the school issue, you'd learn everything you need to know about Catholic social doctrine. And it was in the school issue, they had to say who belongs to whom. And it has to be a mutual and circular system of subsidium. That's Quadragesimo Zamorano, among others. Then what I'd call finally the mature and practical era, 1945 into the 60s. This was the great era of optimism because this notion of the three necessary societies and circular, I'm calling circular subsidiarity, really caught on in Europe. Coalitions of Christian democratic parties, family-friendly center-right governments, Italy, France, Germany, especially the Germans. They achieved political coalitions based upon the basic structure of Catholic social doctrine, far beyond anything we're capable of today. Family-friendly economies, social market economies. And it's interesting that the great movers and shakers of that era post-1945 into the 60s were all born, or just about born, during the Leo's time. They all had that philosophy. Namely, Jacques Maritain, born 1882. Luigi Sturzo in Italy, born 1871. The two founders of EU, Konrad Adenauer, 1876, Robert Schuman, 1886. How about John the 23rd? Pacem in Terris, is on Tranquility of Order, 1881. And a measure of the success, the ability to bring the notion of the necessary societies and their harmony into the public sphere can be captured in the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 16. We look back at it now and say, boy, we could never pull this off today. Quote, "The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled by protection by society and the state." It's the only time the word natural is used in the 1948. Nature or natural is used in the 1948 Declaration. That's how powerful the consensus was after World War II. And even as late as 1966 in the Economic and Cultural Covenant, Article 10, the widest possible protection and assistance should be accorded to the family, which is the natural and fundamental group unit of society. Imagine trying to get that consensus today. And then there was the flood of this, maybe it was the fire of the 1960s. I remember because I was there. A new generation found that each one of these three societies was profoundly imperfect and was suffocating human life rather than making us happy. 50 years ago, in the great year of 1968, a criticism of church, of family, and of polity all went together. And the transient relations of popular culture were made the measure of these long-standing institutions. These long-standing institutions were measured by social, well, they didn't call them social capital theorists back then. And the three necessary societies became at best arbitrary self-chosen platforms for lifestyle. The political common good was denuded of the ordinary attributes of common good, the church denuded of sanctification, and marriage of procreation. polity was left only with the obligation of redistribution. Polity is the organization that sends the checks to your mailbox once a month. And the authorities, this is why just a few years after getting these international bodies to recognize the family as the primary natural unit, 1968, what happened in 68 in the church? Humanae Vitae. The authorities were mortified. We thought we had an agreement about all this stuff, that economies were to serve the family, basically the procreating family. And our authorities, ecclesial, political, and familiar, reconfigured themselves as permissive hierarchies. That is, the authorities gave in. And they deflated these necessary systems. They didn't do away with them, they deflated, discounting, like great inflation. Great inflation is actually deflation, right, of the standards. And so, life in common societies were seen as potentially useful social utilities for one's life plan, rather than being normative, and by which we achieve a life and perfections over generations. But deflation also required the law and moral authorities to mitigate the obligations of membership, to make them easily revisable in order to promote more fluid relationships in culture. That happened. Pope Francis has famously said, "Sometimes I speak of the church as if it were a field hospital." Well, the whole place is a field hospital anymore. And it is an apt metaphor for thinking about what a demographer has recently called our miserable 21st century, in which miseries arise not so much from plagues and natural disasters, or even from totalitarians, but from a failure to cultivate the basic and necessary social forms of living together. It's self-inflicted. Casualties in this field hospital suffer self-inflicted wounds. I have a long section about Catholic divorce, but now, Francis does not hesitate to criticize nation states in this regard. The economic and financial sectors, being transnational, tend to prevail over the political. That is, things that are not communities at all, banking systems, knock out political authority. I mean, political authority is only there to help them out. It's a permissive authority. Francis says, indeed, the global system leaves in suspense the agency and efficacy of the nation state because it's been compromised and suborned. Claiming to enrich rather than to protect its citizens, states joined into a global casino. And like any casino, most of the players lose most of the time. And this is what he calls the world system that renders familiar institutions empty shells of technocracy in the service of the empire of money. I'm just giving Francis's terms. And the most telling symptoms of this in our time: necessary societies are regarded as though they were optional and revisable. The common good, as Professor Zamani says, simply means redistribution of things without any reference to the interior and unitive dimensions of the social bond. And subsidiarity, at best, means a principle of efficiency in view of the lowest or least costly level at which something can be done. It no longer has to do with subsidium. It's devolution, is what is meant by subsidiarity in most places today. Now, concluding thought. Francis often talks about the peripheries. But you know, this is an interesting word. Peripheries are of different sorts, right? Let me give you an example. Let's say we have a real family, consanguinity of the members, mutual caring, but poor. Very vulnerable in its poverty. And they're evicted after losing a single paycheck. Or a family of migrants who follow the father into emigration somewhere. The periphery here is not a social form. In fact, they have what it takes. They're a real family. The periphery here is economic. It has to do with power. Okay, we're all familiar with that kind of periphery. But let me give a different periphery. A household. Shaggy consanguinity, multiple divorces, boyfriend or girlfriends as parents, not really cared for. As Case and Deaton have shown, high rates of mortality and morbidity. This is a quite different periphery. It's an inability to constitute and maintain a necessary social form. It's not merely a material necessity. For his part, the Pope tends to emphasize this kind of periphery. I mean, the first kind of periphery. That is, in which we have to make improvised bonds and plans like the Good Samaritan to help people out, to have solidarity with them. And just as Christ was close to the poor and the broken, we should be close to those who suffer from power deficits of one sort or another. And I understand this periphery. And it's well that the Pope should insist upon paying attention to it, because the teachings of Jesus Christ about his kingdom and his Father's house often turn on understanding this periphery. You come to the aid of the really broken. Poor in the sense of really broken. And by the way, don't give us a bunch of legal generalities about this. We have to improvise when we do this. It's very much a personal mission and response. But here I just use two words. Kingdom. Kingdom. Yes, Jesus teaches about the kingdom in his Father's house. But those are societies. Whereas Francis emphasizes movements and networks that empower and protect, but movements are not a substitute for a common life. We should be talking about kingdoms and houses, the necessary societies, marriage, family, church. And without that framework, how do we answer who belongs to whom? And who is on which periphery? And how can there be a mission? The second person of the divine Trinity becomes incorporatio. He becomes incarnate. Boy, talking about a periphery of the divine. But for the sake of concorporation, right? Jesus comes for the sake of building a kingdom, building a community, and returning people to his Father's house. So even on, I say, Francis's interesting and certainly gospel-based notion of the periphery to the poor and the broken, it has to end up back with these necessary societies. Now, we don't know in the story of the Good Samaritan how the person attacked by brigands, where he ended up. We just know he was put into a hotel for a while and taken care of. But the telos of assisting the broken is to reincorporate them into a society. To say more right now would go into a theological lecture, I suppose. So I should quit while I'm ahead. Thank you. Thanks for putting up with something that was at least 15 minutes too long.
Would you have another 10, 15 minutes for questions?
Okay. Yes.
Could you comment on the role of the university and how it fits into our involvement as members of the university in those three necessary societies?
It's very interesting because in the history of American universities. Medieval, the answer would be easy. But in American universities, you know, our universities did not begin as state universities, obviously. But it was a really interesting notion of circular subsidiarity because it was like Harvard College and so forth, or the College of New Jersey, which ended up becoming Princeton. It was religiously based. I mean, there was a need for properly educated clerics, preachers. It was family-based, to be sure, because especially in the Protestant tradition, these universities came out of religious networks that had basically lay control over many things. And it was for the political common good. It was for the Commonwealth as well. Okay. So the development of the American scheme of higher education stood on all three of those legs. And it really depended upon not fighting too much over them, right? State education just gradually comes into the picture. So I live in Oklahoma, which I like to say, they say in Texas you've got AM Texas and FM Texas. Everyone's in AM Texas, but some people live in FM Texas too. I live in Oklahoma. There's only AM Oklahoma. But out in these lands out here, they're lands of public education. Okay. In the middle of the country, going west. But even there, there was always a mixture of things. The needs of the state, of the polity, the needs of families, especially families that needed to send their sons at first to places like OSU. I mean, they had to learn enough about agriculture to do the family business. And listen, they all had religious lessons. Almost all of them did. Maybe not as required, but as certainly encouraged. They even had lessons that used to be in colleges into the middle of the century, 20th century. You had physical education requirements. People had to learn how to swim. So schools are always an interesting place to look at how the three necessary societies are relating. Today, people don't view it that way because we regard education on market terms, chiefly market. And which means it begins with individual preferences and ends with individual accomplishments. But I would encourage you, schools are a primary place to look for how there's complex relationship between different social groups. Today's problems notwithstanding. Yes, ma'am.
Especially in your article, you emphasize the distinction between the top-down efforts against these necessary societies and the bottom or ground line crisis that we're now in. But I'm wondering if, in looking especially to American history, if you might be able to touch on the way that our movement from the Commonwealth to a more positivistic conception of American law, which is enforced by something like the administrative state, might have, at least might provide a partial explanation.
Yeah. Well, I agree completely. And that would have to be a very complicated story. Commercial codes, the role of courts, and all this kind of thing. You know, today, for a public institution to claim that it's giving subsidium to either marriage and family or to religion would be unconstitutional. If they actually said it. Because it would be picking out one thing over others. Why not give aid to motorcycle gangs? And so we are, at least our elites, who argue about these things, and who are the ones who man the institutions of administrative law and the rest of it, would shiver at the idea that you would talk about tranquility and order, a kind of equilibrium of order in which one kind of community gives assistance to the other. It would be regarded as preferential, probably against the First Amendment in some way or another. I mean, that's how far we've come from an older common law understanding of things. So, yeah, not good. Yes.
So obviously, in practice, we see examples of how these are not recognized or at least valued in Harmony District. Are there any critiques, actual theoretical critiques, offered against these three being necessary?
Well, John Rawls would be an interesting place to start on this, I would say. Rawls, too. The Rawls of political liberalism. Because the Rawls of political liberalism doesn't even recognize polity as a common agreement. Rawls 1 does. In the Theory of Justice, toward the end, he says that political community is a community of communities in political. That completely disappears in political liberalism. So even to regard polity as having an ontological status of some excellence, because you'd have to employ too much metaphysics to get there, and we reasonably disagree over metaphysics and theology and philosophy. Things really get rough for Rawls. In political liberalism and the works he writes after that, where to put the family. And I highly recommend looking at what he says. And most of it's in footnotes, because he wasn't sure himself, so he dumped them into footnotes. But what is family? To what extent does public order have some say over it? He calls it basic structure. To what extent is the family overlapping in the basic structure of our public law? And every time he said something about this, people crawled all over him, saying, you can't say that and be consistent. He seems to have the view, it's just impossible for public order to ignore how people are being formed by families. It can't not pay attention to that. Although, what public order can do to form them is quite controversial and contestable. It's unresolved in those. And he was a really smart guy. So, under the premises of what I would call post-liberal liberalism, these questions of the three necessary societies and how they relate are very vexed. They don't go away. Everyone knows in the back of their mind they're there. Yes?
I wanted to ask a question about your introductory kind of critique of the way social capital analysis has been done. I was kind of detecting maybe a kind of critique of maybe somebody like Robert Putnam.
Right.
I heard bowling examples.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could contrast maybe his way of talking about associations with maybe somebody like Tocqueville. I hear him talked about as, you know, he's kind of like a modern day Tocqueville. I think I've even said that in class before. Maybe I should.
I hope no one's recording like they're recording me right now.
Yeah. I mean, he does, because he does talk about, his second book is about evangelical churches, so
Right.
he's got at least some kind of an eye for some associations maybe being a little bit
He
more
does.
important than others.
And by the way, I would put Putnam in the same league with Case and Deaton. And here's how I would put it. They've got to follow the canons of social science, which is have to be normatively neutral. Right? But they know. They know that these correlations really do suggest something that's not just neutral. And that there's a difference between kinds of societies. And so on. Now, I take the bowling example out of Putnam to simply try to make this. Look, we don't have to make some systematic critique or picture of our current society, which is beyond what a social scientist is really allowed to do. In order to see the correlation between the weakening of what Francis calls links, not even bonds, the weakening of links even, tends to be correlated to a weakening of other things, like bonds. I think that was his point. Point well taken. I think that Case and Deaton go beyond that in their correlations and just specifically say that exclusion from inability to engage and sustain marriage and family, religious congregations, he didn't say which ones, and civic friendship are the telltale signs for the high morbidity and mortality. And point is well taken. But a social scientist, I don't think, are allowed to make the kind of assertions I make throughout my paper. Yes?
Where do you think we should put the world of work, production, exchange? Because it seems to me that it doesn't quite fit into any one of these societies, but it's part of all of them. And yet the modern world has managed to have a system which claims for itself a moral neutrality. But, so it's just a question of calculation that doesn't really fall into the discussion of association other than contraction. So where would you put that?
But, Leo the XIII, Rome Novarum addresses that issue. That the laborer has certain dignity and rights vis-a-vis others in the dignity of his rational foresight in labor. But he goes on immediately and says, well, boy, this becomes doubly important once we put that labor in the context of his family. Care of his family.
But it's still not, it's still the labor and the system of production exchange exceeds the family. I'm wondering if we're not ignoring what is a fourth necessary society because we must all eat. And we must rely on a rather complex arrangements to do so,
Right.
even at the village level.
Right, well, one of the effects of the global capitalism of the late 19th century, when it truly becomes global, that is, read The Empire of Cotton, it's the best account I've ever read of this, in which cotton becomes an international industry linked to insurance companies, shipping, national armies, betting on futures. Every continent on Earth, the interior of every continent on Earth, has been penetrated by this huge system and supply chain that knocks out local economies. Because now, the growing of cotton in places like India and elsewhere is not for local markets. It is not embedded in the local way of life. It's for global markets. So, since the late 19th century, there's been all kinds of problems with re-embedding this kind of activity. This is a enduring sort of problem. And on this, the Empire of Cotton is a historical study. But I think my favorite philosophical study is Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. I find Karl Polanyi's understanding that once markets are disembedded, not just from the household, but even from regional communities like this, that the market eventually, and the system of production and consumption, becomes viewed as a monster. And people, just like a Frankenstein movie, start saying, kill the monster. And that's what gave rise to fascism, according to Karl Polanyi. In other words, the problem is that the people are right, but they overreact, so they start destroying the ecosystem, whatever ecosystem is even there. So how to re-embed production and consumption is a very, very interesting problem. Our, maybe some hippies in Oregon, but I mean, our elites who manage the system are completely uncognizant of the fact that human life cannot consign eating, production, consumption, production to completely anonymous, outsource. I mean, human life can't be what it is if you do it.
That's why I asked, is are we dealing with a fourth necessary society?
The problem is that what is it a society?
Well, it has to be done socially.
It has to be done socially.
Yeah, like what Herman said.
Yeah. It has to be done socially, but things done socially don't always congeal into a society.
But wouldn't that be the argument of, say, of a von Mises, is that it's all just individual? And
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, methodological individualism. And you have raised a great and very deep problem. And I wish I were up to it. I think Francis is not the analyst. He writes in the first person. He's not the analyst on these things. But he deeply feels what's going on with the disembedded. And to some extent, it's worth asking whether it's even capitalism. It's pure extraction is what's going on. In fact, in which the majority of the wealth is just trades between banks at a certain point, which are themselves nowhere. The Beatles always, they're nowhere now. The money is nowhere. Like 80%, back during the Great Recession, 80% of all of the profit that was being made along bank trades. It was not only having more oranges or bananas or anything like that. I mean, is that really capitalism? I mean, is that capital? It's an endless...
It's disembodied.
Yes, it's utterly disembodied. And so I agree. If I had the chance, I would have spent much more time studying the history of this problem than I have. Because it keeps on coming up, and no one seems to solve it. Yes, sir.
I understand you, and hopefully on the 13th correctly, there's a hierarchy among the three necessary societies. Church is higher than family, and family is higher than nation. So,
Well, yes, but it's a kind of factoring in what's unique to each. So, of course, that which has a strictly supernatural end is higher than those having natural. But the one having a supernatural end also gives subsidium to the natural. Right? You know how hard it is to actually love someone as you love yourself? Without grace. But anyway. And so of the two natural, we would say that the polity is more complete because it involves multiplicity of families beyond even your purely natural kin, and it has tasks that really transcend what can be done in the household, like impartial justice, all kinds of other things. But as for what is first in another sense, it is marriage. It is marriage, which is the the fundamental principle of family. Right? You just don't have families. Families in a domestic order begins with marriage. And it's interesting because Leo XIII, in the late 19th century, when he does this Three Societies stuff, he puts marriage in very explicitly. He doesn't just wrap them all up in the term domestic. He recognizes that marriage is the first principle of family. Pius XI skips over that. Now, you can read other things by Pius XI and see that that's what he really meant. But this is why. As against the totalitarianism, which is Pius's issue. And even in Italy, there was a kind of, in fact, the word was invented by Mussolini. They had to protect the family first. Actually, they had very little problems with divorce in Italy because Vittorio Emanuele, back in the 19th century, forbade it in the civil code. Not for any religious reason, just he thought it was unworthy of Italians. But they had big problems with family because the fascists wanted the family. They didn't care about the marriage, the family. And they wanted to organize the family in these sports teams, you know. So Pius made the beeline for family without further complication. But marriage, though it be a principle of family life, has a telos. And the telos, see, marriage itself is not transgenerational. I mean, it's over when the spouse or spouses die. There'll be no marriage in heaven. But you better believe there's family in heaven. You don't have to be a Mormon to believe that. So the point is, there's a way in which the end is superior to the marriage from another point of view. I mean, the end is a transgenerational society. I mean, even people who you will never know.
Does the complicated interrelation, I know now it's not a strict hierarchy, but does that interrelation between the three necessaries and societies somehow issue in what priorities we should be making, what we should be focusing on, given that each of them have been kind of evacuated in current conditions? In other words, how should we be rebuilding in society? How should we be playing categories?
You know, except under conditions of totalitarianism, in which only the very holy survive. Mediocre Christians are not going to survive. But except for those kind of conditions, the church can take care of itself. I mean, not that we shouldn't be interested in the legal and political issues of religious liberty, but I'm telling you, the church, if it wills to do so, is capable of surviving almost any kind of setback. Because unlike polity and domestic order, it has another kind of life that's capable of getting roughed up quite a bit and chugging on. But family is very vulnerable. And so I think that the prioritizing of care of the family through both subsidium of church and sacramental marriage and from the polity that the church took over so many decades is a correct one. It is the vulnerable. And it's so important because it is, in a way, the living nucleus of all the others. And today it's very difficult to do this, right? And it's not just because of governmental policies. It's because of self-inflicted wounds. You've got to factor that in today. It's not just because of the Democratic Party. It's not just because of legislatures in D.C. A lot of this is now self-inflicted. That's case in deep, I'm suggesting. That is, many people do not have the moral energy and focus to do it right. And in Oklahoma they say, there's no fixing stupid. You can't fix stupid. And so That's what complicates the problem. So what program are you going to wheel out, right, for people who are not up to it? But they're into it, they're just not up to it. There's no problem.